Another common problem you'll run into often when working with digital images is you'll often encounter color casts. You maybe weren't paying attention to your white balance setting on your camera, or just the lighting conditions ended up giving a slightly red cast or yellow cast or blue cast or green cast to the image. And you want to very quickly neutralize the image and get back to neutral grays or neutral blacks and whites. There's a variety of different ways to address this problem in Photoshop. I'm going to give you kind of a couple quick ones. First thing I actually recommend is go to the image menu, and there's 3 commands that are called the auto commands. There's auto tone, auto contrast, and auto color. I'm going to choose auto tone, and you'll see what that tries to do is neutralize the shadows and highlights and set a nice overall tone to the image. And I'll do the toggle before and after. Here's Command Z or Control Z, and then Command Z again, so you can see the before and after. Just a quick technique to actually preview before and after. Do anything and then just undo to kind of quickly toggle back and forth. So that was auto tone. Auto contrast, you can see, just darkens and brightens certain areas of the image. It doesn't actually address the color cast of the issue at all. Let me undo that. And then there's auto color, which attempts to neutralize the shadows, midtones, and highlights of the image. You can see I got a pretty decent result here to remove that yellow cast. The problem, however, with those auto commands under the image menu is that they are destructive, right? You're actually changing those values on the actual background layer itself. Let's go ahead and cancel that menu there by clicking. You may want the advantage and flexibility of doing this in a non-destructive way, which means you want to learn how to do the auto commands as an adjustment layer. So I'm going to go ahead and undo this, Command Z, Control Z. And to get the auto adjustments, the auto tone, auto color, or auto contrast, you can just choose either the levels or curves adjustment layer. I'm going to go ahead and choose levels for now. And the reason you can do this is that there's an auto button right here. Now, if I click auto, this is just going to get us the default auto setting. What I want to be able to do is play around with those 3 options that I just showed you: auto color, auto tone, and auto contrast. So I'm going to click the reset button at the bottom of the adjustments panel. And to get to that secret little dialog box where you can actually play with all 3 different variations, I'm going to hold down the Option or Alt key and click on the word auto. And this brings up the auto color correction options dialog. It's kind of a mouthful. And you see I have 3 different algorithms. If I mouse over each one of them, I'll get a little tooltip telling you what each of these radial buttons will do. So the first one here is auto contrast. The second one, if I mouse over that, that's auto tone. And if I mouse over the third one, that's auto color. Now the good part is you don't actually have to memorize these. You can just click on each of these radial buttons to see which one gives you the result you're looking for. And then you have this additional checkbox that's kind of cool. It lets you neutralize the midtones as well, to pull out any color cast in the mid grays as well. So I usually typically leave that on, and then I click between these 3 to see which one looks best. And for this particular image, find dark and light colors and snap neutral midtones is giving me the best result. If I want, I can even actually save these choices as my new default. So when I click that auto button in the adjustment layer panel, these are the choices it's going to use by default. One little additional piece of advice: a lot of Photoshop experts believe that the default values for clipping shadows and highlights aren't quite good enough. So I'm going to click on the color chip for shadows, and I'm looking at the CMYK values for black. And the defaults are 75, 68, 67, and 90. What I'm going to recommend you do is you change these slightly. Leave cyan at 75, magenta, make that 63. If I hit the tab key, I can jump to the Y field and type in 63 there. Jump into the tab key again, and then for K, for black, I'll type in 95. And what this has given me a much richer black than the default settings. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And same thing for the highlights. Right now, when we clip the highlights, or when Photoshop clips the highlights for you, it's taking the white pixels in the image to absolute white, to absolute 255. And you typically don't want that. You want some level of gray, some gray detail even in the highlights, so you actually see some pixel value there that has some detail. If you make it absolute white, then you're basically blowing it out to solid white and you have no detail. You really would only see something like that happen in like a specular highlight, like glint off a chrome bumper or something. That's where it would blow out to absolute white. Otherwise, you want some level of detail there. So I'm going to change the CMYK values here to 5, tab 3, tab 3, 0, just to ensure that there is some pixel detail even in your highlights. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And the good news is you'll only have to change those numbers once. I'll bring them up on screen just real quick. Shadows are 75, 63, 63, 95. Click OK. Highlights are 5, 3, 3, 0, and click OK. Because when you click OK this last time, Photoshop's going to ask you if you wanted those to be your defaults. Now, it didn't happen on my screen because I'd already chosen it, but on your screen, you would see a checkbox that says, do you want these to be the new defaults? You would say yes. And now every time you click that auto button, you're going to get those same better results. Let's go ahead and delete this levels adjustment layer, and I'll show you now what I mean by clicking that auto button. I'm going to go ahead and click on the trash can at the bottom of the adjustments panel. Yes, I want to delete that layer, levels 1. I'll go back to the levels adjustment layer in the adjustments panel, and I'll click that auto button, and you'll see I get that new result because I've saved those defaults. So that's how you get auto tone, auto contrast, or auto color as a non-destructive adjustment layer, which can be turned on or off. You can mask it, you can lower the opacity and blend it back down to the original and so forth. All the flexibility that adjustment layers give you, but still taking advantage of those quick auto commands. Converting a color image to black and white or grayscale is also a very common request that I get a lot. How do you do that? What's the best way to do it? There's a variety of ways. I'm going to teach you the quickest, easiest way. In the adjustments panel, there's a specific adjustment for black and white conversion, and it's called black and white. I'm going to go ahead and click on that adjustment layer to bring up the controls for it. And you'll see that there are individual sliders for specific colors. So red, yellow, green, cyan, blue, and magenta. What this lets you do is specifically adjust individual colors as how they map to grayscale and have fine-tuned control over that. So let's turn this adjustment layer off for a moment. In the layers panel, there's an eye for it. And you can see I chose this image because there's lots of individual colors in the sweater, and it helps you see how these colors are individually being adjusted to grayscale when you start using the slider. So you can see there's a green stripe, there's a magenta stripe, a red stripe, and so on, and then the blue of the pants. And there's even a little bit of yellow in the shirt as well, and yellow in the hair. So let's turn that layer back on, that black and white adjustment layer, and let's take the green slider first. As I drag that left and right, you can see only the green stripes are adjusting the image, or anywhere there's green in the image underlying. So it makes it real easy to specifically adjust where the greens are going to grayscale. Same thing for yellows. So if I want to darken the hair or lighten the hair, I have independent control over the yellows in the image. Each color can be adjusted separately. If I want the reds, be a little bit different there, and it helps you distinguish the individual tones from each other. Make the blues either darker or lighter to adjust the pants and so forth. So it's very, very cool actually. And you have the targeted adjustments option for the black and white adjustment layer as well, meaning if I click on this little tool here in the panel, the finger tool, I can actually click in the image itself and start dragging left or right to adjust those particular tones. Once you have the grayscale image overlaying the color image, you don't necessarily remember which colors are which anymore that are in that original image. So like, I don't remember what color this is, and I don't have to. With the targeted adjustment tool, I can just click right there and start dragging left and right to adjust those particular colors that are directly under the cursor. So it makes it real easy to very quickly dial in that custom black and white conversion that you're looking for to get all the separate tones looking as best as possible when you look at your overall adjustment. Okay, one thing I tend to do after doing a black and white conversion using the black and white adjustment layer is also increase contrast, and I'll use another adjustment layer to do that. You can stack these on top of each other, of course. So I'm going to go back to the adjustments panel and click on the back button to take us back to the list. And I'll go ahead and click on the curves adjustment layer. And from our preset list, I'm going to choose linear contrast. And that's not quite enough, so I'm going to go back to the preset list and choose increase contrast. And that's giving me kind of that punchier black and white look that I'm looking for. Great. And to kick this off a little bit more, I'm going to add a couple special effects to it. I want to create what's called a vignette. I want to burn the corners in to pull the focus into the center of the image. And I'm going to add a stroke, a white border to the outside of the image as well. To do that, I'm going to add a new layer to the top of this layer stack. And I'm going to go ahead and hold down the Option and Alt key to teach you a little bonus trick here. If I hold down the Option or Alt key and click on the new layer icon, that gives me a chance to create a new layer and set some properties for it. I'll cancel this for a moment. If I just click the new layer icon, all I get is a blank new layer called Layer 1. I'm going to undo that, Command or Control Z. I'm going to Option or Alt click on the new button. This brings up the new layer dialog, and I'm going to choose the overlay blend mode and fill this layer that I've just created with 50% gray. I want to have some pixels here so that I can apply a filter to it. There are a lot of filters that you can't actually run on an empty layer. So this is a trick to end up with a layer filled with gray. I'm going to call it Vignette and Stroke. Go ahead and click OK. And the image doesn't look any different because the overlay blend mode ignores gray pixels, right? So there's kind of a handy little thing there. First, let's add a stroke to this image by going to the effects icon at the bottom of the layers panel and choosing stroke from that effect. I've got a size of 20 and a white stroke. That's looking actually pretty good. I'm just going to make that a little bit bigger. We'll make it, say, 30 pixels. And I can just type in 30 if I want. Go ahead and click OK. And there's my border. Now I want to frame in those corners and do that vignette effect. So to do that, I'm going to go to Filter, Lens Correction. And in the Custom tab, there's a vignette slider. And you can see it goes from darken to lighten. I'm going to darken those corners, drag it all the way over to the left, and you can see I'm getting a nice burning effect on those corners. And I can decide how far in I want that to come in from the corners by changing the midpoint. So I'm going to make it 35. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And what that does is that burns in those corners. Because the blend mode is set to overlay, the dark corners are darkening the corner of the image. And anywhere there's gray pixels in the middle, there's going to be no change. So here's before and there's after. It's a nice custom black and white conversion with nice dramatic contrast. And I've got that nice white border and burning effect of the vignette corners. One thing I like to do is select the range of layers and adjustment layers that make up the after effect. And I like to group them, Command G or Control G on your keyboard, and turn them into a folder. And then with one click of the eye on the group level, I can see before and after and see where I ended up very quickly. So there you have it, some nice, fun, easy ways to do color to grayscale or color to black and white, and then also increase contrast and really add that nice vignette and border effect at the same time. In this video, I want to talk to you about the curves adjustment layer and how it's similar but different at the same time as the levels adjustment layer. So if we take a look at this image, it's got a levels adjustment layer already applied to it. I can turn that off to show you where we started. And we added a levels adjustment layer to this image to actually give it some pop and some contrast. If I click on the actual icon for the levels adjustment in the layers panel, you can see where I've put the sliders. So I've made the black slider 15 and the white slider 210 just to establish a true black and white in the image. Now what I want to be able to do though is increase the contrast in the midtones as well. You can see in the levels histogram user interface here, I've only got 3 levels of control, 3 sliders. I can set a black point, a white point, and then I can adjust the middle range. If I click that gray slider and drag it left or right, I am opening up or dampening down the midtone range. And you can see as I move that gray slider, I'm never touching the absolute black or the absolute white in the image. I'm just changing everything in between. Okay, that's great for most images, but every once in a while, you want to make an adjustment between, say, the 3/4 tones. I don't have a little slider between black and gray. I want a slider right here in the middle of that particular range. But levels doesn't give me that level of control. I've only got those 3 particular sliders. So let's go back to the main list of adjustments by clicking the back button, and let's go over to the curves adjustment layer. Now, it looks a little bit fancier and kind of a more geeky interface, but it turns out that levels and curves are almost identical. It's just a different user interface. To start out with, what Curves has done is taken those level sliders in that histogram and put it at an angle. So you can see the same kind of histogram piles of pixels chart overlaid on this graph. And I've only got 2 sliders to start out with, a black slider and a white slider. Let's go back to levels. If you imagine this horizontal graph rotated at an angle, I'm starting out with actually 1 fewer slider. I don't have a slider in the middle. I only have black or white. The value of curves, or the benefit of curves relative to levels, is that I can add many more control points, up to 16, I believe. If I actually click in the middle of the chart, I've just added that middle slider that I have in levels. If I want a 3/4 tone adjustment, I can click right here in the 3/4 tone part of the graph. And now I've got a slider, if you will, in between the middle and the absolute black. So if I want to adjust it and make those shadows lighter, I can just drag that part of the graph by clicking on that handle and drag it up. And you can see I'm lightening those 3/4 shadow tones. If I drag the control point down, you can see I'm actually darkening those 3/4 shadow tones. So I have a lot more control by using curves, by putting down a control point exactly between the ranges that I want to adjust. I can do the same thing in the 3/4 highlights. So I'm going to click right on that graph. And again, if I want to brighten them, I'll drag that control handle up. If I want to dampen them down, I can drag it down. So you can see I've got a lot of control here. I'm going to go ahead and reset by clicking the reset button to get us back to where we started. And as you might expect, there are some presets that you can actually choose from. If I go to the curves list where it says default, I've got several different presets that I can choose from. If I want to increase the contrast, one of the ones I like is the linear contrast. I'm going to go ahead and choose that. And you can see what Photoshop has done for me is it's automatically dropped down 2 additional control points, shifted the shadows down slightly, and shifted the highlights up slightly. This is commonly called an S curve because this curve on the graph starts to look like a very subtle S shape. The more pronounced the S curve, the more contrast you'll be adding to the image. So if I drag this shadow part down and drag the highlight part up, you can see it starts to look more like an S, so an S curve. You can see I've dramatically increased the contrast. In fact, if I go back to that preset list and choose some of the stronger contrast presets, you'll see that curve is even more pronounced as an S, and it's actually got a couple more control points. So over time, you'll learn how to create your own S-curve shapes based on the image that you're working with. You can always start with that preset. I always typically start with linear contrast and to kind of see where I'm at. Again, to see the before and after, here's before. Click on that eye at the bottom of the panel. We'll click it back on to see after. And you can see it's a nice subtle 3/4 tone adjustment or increasing the contrast in those midtones. So that's kind of the difference between curves and levels. Initially, they're actually very identical. It's just a slightly different user interface. Levels gives you the controls on a horizontal plane. It gives you 3 control points to start out with. Curves just takes those level sliders, tilts them at a 45-degree angle, and only starts out with those 2 sliders because you can click on the graph exactly where you want to add a slider and get that real fine-tuned control of adjusting the contrast between specific ranges of tonality. One of the more common problems you'll run into when working with digital images is they tend to sometimes be flat. They don't have a lot of contrast. And here's an example of this image. It's great composition and nice color, so forth, but it's just looking a little flat. It needs to be a little bit pumped up and have stronger blacks and stronger whites. Now, there's a variety of different tools in Photoshop and features that let you address this problem. I'm going to teach you about levels, and specifically the levels adjustment layer. Now, before we do that, I've got a layer here called 256 levels. I'm going to go and turn that on. And it's just a gradient from left to right, where it goes from black to white. What this represents is the number of tones or grayscale values there are per channel in an RGB image. It turns out that an RGB image is actually made up of 3 channels of light: red light, green light, and blue light. In fact, if I go ahead and turn off the 256 levels layer, and so I can just see my color image again, and I'll go to the channels panel inside Photoshop here. If we take a look at just the red channel by clicking on the word red, you'll see it's a grayscale image where each color value is mapped to a grayscale value. So the brighter the color, the lighter the grayscale value. So where there's going to be a lot of red in the red channel, that red color would be represented by a light pixel. If it doesn't have a lot of red, then it will be dark. So if you can take a look at the blue strap here, or the blue of their shirt, those pixels end up being dark because there's not a lot of red in them. Likewise, if I click on the green channel, you'll see parts of the image that have green in them will be brighter. Parts of the image that don't have green in them will be darker. And the same thing for the blue channel when you click on blue. So when you break down a color image into 3 individual channels of light and think about each of those channels being represented by a grayscale image, how many different levels of gray are there per channel? It's 256. 0 is black, 255 is white, and then every gray value in between is assigned a specific number between that range. Let's go back to the RGB channel so I see all the composite red, green, blue channels together and see my color image. We'll go back to our friend the layers panel. I know the channels panel can be a little scary for folks. Let's go back over to layers, and we'll turn on that 256 levels layer again. What I want to teach you here is what happens when you start adjusting the levels with the levels adjustment layer. Let's go ahead and do that. Go to the adjustments panel. I'm going to click on the icon for levels to bring up that editor. Now there are 3 knobs or dials that you can play with in the levels histogram here. Now if you take a look at this chart, this nerdy word histogram, that is a chart of the tonal values in your image. How many pixels per tone? So if you look at the black slider, that represents tonal value 0. If you look at the white slider, that represents tonal value 255. And then your middle slider is your 50% gray point, your middle point. And this slider will adjust automatically based on where you move the white and black sliders. It's always going to try to find the absolute middle between black and white if you don't touch it. You can always override it and move it yourself, but if I start dragging the white slider, you'll see that gray slider moves with it to always find the new mathematical center of the range of tones. So what's happened when you actually move these sliders? Okay, I'm going to turn on some guides to help us out here. I'm going to go to my View menu and Show Guides. And what I've done is I've actually drawn out some guides which will be useful in a moment. I'm going to switch to my eyedropper tool. I'm going to press the letter I. I'm going to bring up my Info panel under the Window menu, Window Info. And as I move the eyedropper around my screen, you'll see some numbers in the RGB section of the Info panel. And they're split in half because it's showing you a before and an after value. Right now, since I haven't done anything in the levels panel, they're still at the default values here. I'm just seeing the same numbers for both RG and B on the before and after side of that split. If I put my cursor all the way over to the left, you'll see that that's tonal value 0. So that's absolute black. Those pixels on the very left edge there are 100% black, or tonal value 0. If I move the cursor all the way over to the right, you can see the tonal value is 255, so absolute white. And if I actually got out rulers and found out my precise middle of this particular image in terms of pixel dimensions, I would find 128 as my midpoint gray, and there it is right about there. So back to what happens when you actually start adjusting the level sliders. I'm going to take this black slider and drag it all the way over to 20. And what I'm telling Photoshop to do is, hey, Photoshop, every pixel in this image that has a tonal value of 0 to 20, I want them all to become 0. So now, to kind of prove this to you, if I move my mouse anywhere over here to the left of this guide, you'll see on the right side in the info panel, so take a look at the left numbers and the right numbers. The left numbers are where we started. The right numbers are where we're going after doing this adjustment in the levels adjustment layer. If I move my mouse anywhere between the edge of the image and that blue guide, you can see all those tonal values have now been remapped to absolute black. They've all become 0 in terms of tonal value. The new midpoint is going to be somewhere else than the actual precise middle of the image because we've shifted all those grayscale values over proportionally, as I adjust that black slider. So same thing with the white slider. If I move that to the left to say 224, sounds good. As I move my mouse in the area to the right of this blue guide, you'll see that all those pixels have now been mapped to white, or 255. And again, that middle triangle, the grayscale triangle, moved in proportion with that white slider. So really what you're doing is you're setting a stronger black and a stronger white, and you are going to be clipping detail in the process. And we'll cover that in just a moment. But you are shifting certain range of pixels to go absolute black and a certain range of tonal pixels to go absolute white, and then your grayscale value changes in between. Let's go ahead and reset this adjustment layer. There's a click of a button here at the bottom where it says Reset to Adjustment Defaults. So it's like nothing's happened. I'm going to go ahead and turn off that 256 levels layer because that was just for visual purposes. And I'll go ahead and close the info panel, and so that's not distracting, we'll turn off the guides as well. View, Show, Guides. All right, so we've got our original color image again. You can see the histogram is now reflecting the chart or the tonal values of the color image instead of having that grayscale layer turned on. It's just showing you the histogram of the layer stack as it's currently seen with the layers turned on or off. So here, when you take a look at this histogram, it actually tells you quite a bit of information. It's telling you there are gaps, there are missing tones in this image. You can see there isn't actually a pure 100% white set of pixels because there's no piles of pixels represented in that part of the graph. There's also not an absolute black set of tones in the image because there's no stack of pixels in the black area as well. So the way you work with levels is you simply move these sliders to where the piles of pixels begin in the chart. If I move that black slider to the right about level 5 here, that's where there are some pixels that have that tonal value. There's not a lot of them, but there are a few. The image actually already starts to look a little bit better. Here, I'll turn it on and off. Here's before, and there's after. Now, it's very subtle, but you did see a shift. Not very many pixels became zeros because there weren't a lot of pixels in that range anyway. But remember that middle slider moved with the black slider. So it's actually remapping the midtones and making them darker as you slide that over to the right, meaning you're increasing contrast in that range of pixels. I'm going to go ahead and move that slider all the way over to level 15. And I've told Photoshop every tonal value from 0 to 15, you're now going to go to 0. Now, are you losing detail in the shadows? Yes, absolutely. But are you losing much detail? In this particular image, no, because there weren't a lot of pixels that had that tonal range in them anyway. Let's move that white slider over to the left, and we'll take this down to say 195, okay, right there. Now here I am starting to lose a little bit of detail on the right side of her face, and I can kind of just see that really quickly visually here. But if you really want to be sure where you should start moving the slider to, a good rule of thumb is always to start where the actual piles of pixels begin in the chart, okay, right there. So it turns out that's about 218 in this particular image. And then if you want to increase the contrast even more, it's helpful to see where you're going to be clipping detail in those highlights as you drag the slider. So here's a little power tip for you. Hold down the Option key or Alt key on Windows, and when you drag the white slider or the black slider, it gives you what's called a clipping preview. As I move that slider left or right, you'll see on the screen where certain pixels are going to be blowing out to absolute 255 or white in our analogy here. As you can see in the side of that face, if I go over to 189 or 187 or whatever, you can see I'm really starting to clip a lot of detail on the highlight side of their face. So with the Option key held down or the Alt key held down, I can just keep dragging that white slider left or right until I'm satisfied with getting as much boost in contrast in the highlights as possible, but deciding where I don't want to clip detail anymore. So I'm going to take this particular image, let's say 210, and that looks about good. I'm not losing much detail, but I've increased the overall brightness and contrast of the image. Here's our before. We can click on the eye at the bottom of the adjustments panel to see the before. Here's after. And you can see I've made that image have much more visual pop. I've got great contrast. I've established a true black and a true white and adjusted the overall tone quality of the image. And the best part, because it's an adjustment layer, it's non-destructive. I can turn the whole layer on and off. I can lower its opacity if the effect is too strong. I can lower it, and I can even mask it off if needed. So there you have it. I hopefully have taught you not just about the levels adjustment layer, but how levels actually work. And then you can apply that to any image that has a little bit of flat, no contrast issue. Move the black slider in, move the white slider in to where the piles of tiles or piles of pixels begin. If you want to take it even further, hold down that Option or Alt key as you drag those sliders so you can actually see where detail is going to be clipped in the process. One of Photoshop's most versatile features are adjustment layers. If you take a look over on the right, you'll see an adjustments panel. And in the adjustments panel is a whole collection of different types of adjustments you can make to an image, typically things like adjusting color and tone or contrast. If you don't know what any of these icons are, you just simply mouse over them and you'll see the name appear in the upper left-hand corner. You'll also get a little tooltip if you pause for a second, telling you a little bit more about each adjustment. So things like brightness and contrast, levels, curves, converting to black and white, and so forth. Now, adjustment layers are so wonderful because they're non-destructive. They're layers which can be turned on or off, can be masked, and so forth. They're not to be confused with some of the legacy adjustments that have been in Photoshop for years, which are located under the Image menu. If I go to Image, Adjustments, you'll see a lot of the same words here, levels, curves, black and white, and so forth. The difference between these adjustments under the Image Adjustments menu is that these are destructive. They actually permanently change pixels in the image if you then save the file. I'll give you an example of that. If I choose levels, which can be used to do tonal adjustments on the image, let's go ahead and open up the midtones by taking that middle slider and dragging it to the left a little bit. We'll just do something radical. Not that we would actually do this in a real image. We'll go ahead and click OK. Because I was on the background layer, I've actually permanently changed those pixels if I were to close this file and save it. In fact, if I go back to Image, Adjustments, Levels, you'll see I'm not starting from my original start point. I've actually damaged those pixels there, and I'm getting a much different histogram or graph of the tonal levels inside this document. I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel, and I'm going to undo that original levels command that we just did to get back to where we started. In contrast, let's take a look at the difference of how an adjustment layer works instead. We'll click on the levels adjustment, and instead of a modal dialog box that covers most of your screen here, all those same adjustments that you just saw in the levels dialog are available directly in the adjustments panel, which means it's a lot easier to get in front of your work here without having this dialog box covering up your screen. So I'm going to go ahead and do that same levels adjustment, that radical shift. We took the middle triangle to 1.9 in the dialog. We'll do the same thing in the panel, or roughly. We get pretty much the same result, but notice that the histogram's not changing because it's not destructive. You've just shifted the pixels momentarily. If we take a look at the layers panel, you can see when we added the levels adjustment layer, it actually shows up in the layers panel as a separate row, which means you can turn its visibility off. That's just to prove that, again, it's non-destructive. You can turn it on or off and hide or display that particular effect. The other cool thing is if I go back and click on any particular layer, you'll see the adjustments panel lights back up with all the options that you can choose from again. But if I actually click on an adjustment layer itself that's already been added to this layer stack, you'll see I'm taken right back to that interface, and it's remembering the last settings I used for that particular adjustment. At the bottom of the adjustments panel, you'll actually see there's a button here where I can reset that adjustment back to its default setting. So if I click that button, you'll see it's as if I haven't done anything to the file at all. So I can always get back to the beginning for each individual adjustment that I might use. Let's go ahead and do some interesting adjustment. We'll just open up those midtones a little bit and maybe darken the image just a touch. The other thing that's interesting about adjustment layers is that you can use multiple adjustment layers on the same file. You're not just limited to one. If I want to go back to the full set of the adjustment layer options that I had at my disposal, there's a little back button at the bottom of the adjustments panel. We'll go ahead and click that to be taken back to the list of adjustments that we can choose from. I'm going to go ahead and click on the black and white adjustment. And you see now I've got two different adjustments stacked on top of each other, and each one can be turned on or off. So the levels adjustment is what we use to increase contrast, and then this black and white adjustment was something we could use to convert to black and white without losing the color information down below. You can see it's just a layer, so I can turn it on and off. I can go ahead and delete an adjustment. I'm going to go ahead and click on the levels adjustment layer in the layers panel, and there's a little trash can in the adjustments panel to get rid of it. And it says, do you really want to do that? Yes, you can click the don't show again checkbox so you don't get that error message anymore. I'll go ahead and click yes. And I'm back to just this single black and white adjustment layer. Let's go ahead and click on that adjustment layer again to select it. And you can see I have my individual controls for changing how each color converts to black and white. So I can go ahead and make some adjustments here. I'll change the cyan and the blue sliders to change how they're being converted to black and white. There's several other advantages of adjustment layers as well. Because they're just like any other layer, one of the first things you might want to try playing with is their opacity. If you take a look at the layers panel itself, you'll see the opacity value set to 100%. That's the default. And if I have my move tool active, which I do, if you don't, you just press the letter V on your keyboard to switch to the move tool. I can just type a number to blend this black and white adjustment layer, or any adjustment layer, back down with the layers underneath it. I'm going to press the number 8 to just make this 80% opaque. You can see I'm getting mostly black and white with just a hint of color back into the image because I'm getting a blend now between the black and white conversion and that original color layer. Again, just reinforcing that these adjustment layers are non-destructive. The other thing you can do with adjustment layers is actually change their blending mode. Again, every layer has blend modes available to them. The default blend mode is normal here in the layers list. I can actually change that blend mode to a variety of ones. I'm going to go ahead and choose overlay, which is a way to really dramatically increase contrast. So what I've done is taken this black and white adjustment layer, changed its blend mode to overlay with 80% to make this really punchy, high contrast, very saturated color effect. I'm going to go back and change the blend mode back to normal. And then the last kind of big picture benefit of adjustment layers is that every adjustment layer has a built-in layer mask already attached to it, which means if I only want the adjustment to happen in a particular area of an image, all I have to do is grab my brush tool and start painting where I want that adjustment to be masked. I'm going to press the B key on my keyboard to switch to the brush tool. You can see my circular cursor there. And my foreground color is set to black right now, which means anywhere I paint on this layer, only the layer mask is active here. Anywhere I paint with black, I'm going to hide the adjustment of this black and white conversion. So what I want these red shoes to come back in full color. So I'm going to start painting with black right where those red shoes are. You can see as I paint over that area with the black paint, I'm getting the full version of that color red shoe. Now I can see I painted too far into the pants, so I'm just going to press the X key to exchange my foreground and background colors. Now that my foreground color is white, I can remove from the mask by painting with white over that area. I'll press X again to switch colors, and I'm just going to very quickly paint over where I don't want the black and white conversion with the muted color effect. I want the full red shoe effect to come back. So I'll just go paint over this red shoe and this red shoe and then that one here and this other one in the background. So you can see adjustment layers are very flexible. They're non-destructive. You can turn them on and off. You can change their opacity. You can click on the word opacity and adjust the slider there. You can change their blend mode. We'll change that back to overlay. Change it back to normal. And then every adjustment layer has a built-in layer mask that you can actually start painting on directly to hide where that adjustment's taking place. If you've never played with adjustment layers, I highly encourage you to start adding them to your workflow. They're very flexible. They're all available here in the adjustments panel. If you want to get back to the list on any given adjustment layer, just click that back button to go back to the main list in the adjustments panel, and then you can keep grabbing other adjustments and stacking them on top to get the desired effect you're looking for.